Thank you so much.
Go on, we'll chop it down.
You'll chop it? Okay.
Right. The first question that I want to ask you is a question you asked Leila at yesterday's session, which is that you told her that your writing comes from a place that you're passionate about, which is fraught with danger, which is dangerous. Where is that place for her? And she replied. But I want to pose the same question to you and ask you where that place that you're passionate about, that is fraught with danger, that is dangerous, lies for you, the place that your writing comes from.
Right. I think that the things that I find touch me most nearly and that I care hugely about, and therefore that I write about, or that my writing comes from. Yeah, so that was an exploration of that.
Right.
Can you say that you actually do love someone and know them across cultures, and what are the power relationships that are inherent in language?
Right.
And also the question of the representation of the part of the world that I come from in the part of the world that I find myself in. So basically this whole issue of the representation of the Arab culture, of Islam and Muslims, of Egypt in the West. So let's say that the Map of Love was primarily written out of that. Since then I would list a couple of other things. One is a general concern with the way the world is going.
Right.
I mean, it sounds very grandiose and it sounds a bit kind of a bit phony, but it really isn't. It's a real concern about losing the way somehow, and about the kind of world that we are leaving for our children and for younger people.
Right.
And what is the path back, as it were? And if you live in a country like Egypt, it's almost something that you see, because you see things disintegrating. You see behaviors that would not have been possible 10 years ago, as well as the physical world. And so that's a very, very real question. Alongside this, of course, and very connected to it, is the issue of Palestine. Because my sense and my belief and my conviction is that the problem of Palestine is becoming a problem that is infecting the whole world. Because in a sense it is anachronistic. It's a remnant from the days of colonialism, and therefore it's jarring. It's out of place in the world today. Of course, we live in an age of neocolonialism. But the neocolonialism is practiced and is carried out in a different way, mostly. But by people actually coming and demolishing your home and taking your home, that is a throwback to a long time ago. It is such an area of injustice, and it is so much in the heart and the focus of the world that it is very, very troublesome. And also, for it to happen, for the Israelis to be able to get away with what is essentially the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, they have to represent the local culture in a particular way. And so basically you get the local culture represented as violent, as primitive, the whole thing, having no partner for peace and so on. You get the Christian presence elided, just sort of completely erased. And so then you can represent the issue as a sort of a primeval struggle between religions, Islam on the one hand and Judaism on the other, which is of course a total and absolute nonsense. And so, but this representation then infects the whole world. And so you have in the United States of America, you have 40 million people who believe in Armageddon, who believe that Israel has to prevail so that the end of days can come, so that the last, the world can reach its fulfillment through a bloodbath, basically, and who work towards it. And some of them are in power. This would not have happened. It would have not have been necessary if there had not been the Israel-Palestine question and everything that it involves. So for me, there is both this sort of this very big issue of how it's infecting the whole world, and there is the immediate day-to-day issue of people that I know and that I see who are unable to get medical treatment, unable to travel, unable to, just the daily hindrances and humiliations. So again, out of that comes work.
Ahdaf, since we're talking about Palestine, I would like to talk about Egypt, and I would like to refer to something that you've written about, you've spoken about, which is that Egyptian policies, especially with reference to water and with reference to agriculture, are very affected and hugely influenced by Israel. I would like you to elaborate on that for our viewers,
Yes.
and say how Egyptian policies, government policies, are being influenced so deeply by Israel.
Yes. Well, the premise that we start from is that the regime in Egypt is very unpopular, and that for a very long time now, our perception as Egyptians is that the country is not being run in the interests of the Egyptian people. And the primary motivation of the people who are governing us is that they should remain in power, and they should remain in power in order to continue ransacking and looting the country. Now, the main support that they have to remain in power is, of course, the Western powers, particularly the United States, and the price that they pay in order to be supported is to run policies that are really favoring Israel. So you take, for example, a burning issue, an unintended joke here, of Egyptian gas. So we have natural gas, we extract it, we have a treaty, a deal with Israel, which means that today we export our gas to Israel at less than the cost of extracting it, and we are tied to that. Now, you have Egyptian citizens actually suing the government, because in Egypt the law is kind of very important. It's got, from very long ago, it's got a halo. So we've had an Egyptian citizen suing the government on the basis that it is, in this instance, it is working against the common good, because there are people who don't, the majority of people don't have gas. You in fact have seen sometimes where the queues for butane gas are enormous, and meanwhile our gas is going to the Israelis at less than cost. Yeah, and so the court actually judges in his favor and says that the government must stop. So the government appeals, and eventually the highest court rules in his favor, but the government does nothing about it and continues to export oil, gas. Now, what this means as well, of course, is that the authority of the law is undermined. If a court decides and the government does not, so what do you do then? So what do you do? So there's that. There is, of course, always the question of the Israelis, exporting Nile water, and so far we've managed to not do that because there's such a fuss when they try to do it. But then, of course, we know that Israel is working in Africa, in the countries below us, to do something about that. And there's always talk about sort of cutting a canal that goes to Sinai and all that. So far, none of that has happened. Agriculture. We used to, for example, forget the wheat. Wheat is the biggest and most critical thing, of course, and we used to have wheat for us and enough for, to export as well. And now I think we produce something like 20% of our own wheat, and the rest of it comes in the form of aid from the United States, or we have to buy it from abroad. And of course, the whole justification is, you plant expensive things like flowers, and then you export them for perfume, and then the money that comes back is enough to buy wheat. But that is not true, because the money that comes back to one person who is the capitalist who is doing it, and he's not going to buy wheat and feed the people. So there's the bread issue, and you have people dying in queues for bread. Now, tomatoes. We used to produce all our own tomatoes. Now, what is happening, and I know this sounds very strange, and I don't know the scientific words for it, but it used to be that you sowed your seeds, you got your crop, and then from that same crop you planted the next crop. Now we are in a position where the things that we plant, they won't give you the seedlings to plant the next crop. You have to import your seedlings from Israel. Thank you.
But they won't give you the seedlings, or the government won't allow you to use
or the government won't allow. I don't really understand which it is. But the fact is that we plant tomatoes, but we can't replant without getting those seedlings, and those seedlings come to us from abroad over and over and over. Large swathes of land in Egypt, particularly along the canal area, are leased to firms which turn out to be Israeli firms. Whether they operate with a frontman or not, they turn out to be Israeli firms. And when eventually something breaks open and people take the government, the Minister of Agriculture or whatever to task, then, and it's become open, it's become a scandal, they can't say it's not true, then they say things about transferring technology and how we need the technology of the Israelis. And of course this really hurts, because you have been an agricultural country for 7,000 years, you know, and now all of a sudden you need Israeli expertise to come and lease your land and tell you how to plant your crops, you know. So there are all sorts of things like that where you know that you feel the sort of the hands kind of, you know, playing around.
The next question is, what is the solution to this? I mean, if you're talking about, for example, if there's a revolution like the kind that occurred in Iran, that comes with its own pitfalls.
Exactly, I know.
How does one go ahead here as an activist? What is the solution? On the other hand, you have a government that is making everything come to naught, so you're up against a wall.
This is the question that
I'm talking about Egypt, obviously.
I know. This is the question that we all ask ourselves, quite frankly. I mean, basically, for example, we've been watching what's been happening in Tunis. And we've been very excited by it. But of course you also hear, I mean, you hear voices saying, now will Egypt move? And then you hear other voices saying, Egypt is too big, Egypt is too heavy, we don't know what would happen, we don't know what would happen. You know, the devil you know better than the devil you don't. Let's just sort of carry on like this for a bit. So really, really, the true answer is that I don't know. That one hopes, of course, that something can happen through democratic change, which is why there's always such a fuss during election time, which is why when we've got the presidential elections next year, there's a great effort being made to try and get some kind of fair thing happening. And if it happens that the Muslim Brotherhood come to power through free and fair elections, so be it. Let us live through that phase. We don't have a problem with that. It's a democracy. Let's do that. But it really does not look as if our government is going to allow a peaceful and democratic change of government to take place. So, you know, what's going to happen? Will we get to a situation where people actually sort of erupt and you get sort of like, you know, blood on the streets, and will the army come down? You know, nobody knows. We've been saying for a while that it feels very unstable, and that it feels dangerous, and all the activism that happens is kind of, you know, in specific areas, and it's all young people, and it's all really without a leadership. But it's there, it's keeping the streets alive. We've never had as much civil unrest in Egypt as we've had in the last 5 years. And that is good. And that is good, you know. But how will it coalesce, and what shape will that take?
Coming to activism for Palestine now, the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement is something that people are really talking about.
Yes.
But I would like to know what you think, where you think this BDS movement will go in the next 5 years. Where do you see it going? Do you see it achieving a concrete aim in like the next 5 years or so? How do you see it growing? In what direction?
Well, I am very hopeful.
Right.
Of course, I have to be hopeful.
Right. Right.
But I think that's good. I mean, I think BDS. I mean, if you think of it, 5 years ago you couldn't talk about BDS in the West, really. It was very, very difficult. Now it has become commonplace. It has become easy. 10 years ago you couldn't talk about Palestine, or you had to sort of make, all sorts of preambles and introductions and so on. And now you talk about it, people know where you are, you expect to find sympathy, you expect to find a certain amount of knowledge. Now, given the sorry state of the Arab world at the moment, and given that none of us likes violence or, thinks in terms of military options, which are in any case not there. So what we need to work on two angles. One is Western public opinion. The other is Israelis themselves. Yes. And economics. So there are three. Yeah. And BDS works to all of these. So that basically when Elvis Costello cancelled his concert, that had reverberations everywhere. That had reverberations in the New York Times. That had, and it,
there's cultural reverberation, there's an economic.
Exactly. And basically, and I have young friends who are Israeli dissidents and activists who are part of, for example, Breaking the Silence, and they say that it has to be that Israel pays a price for what it's doing, because otherwise why is it going to pull back? Why is it going to stop? So the fact that Israel is allowed to consider itself as part of the family of civilized nations, it's in the Eurovision Song Contest, it's in the European football games, this should not be possible. And that's what this is all about. So basically to make Israelis feel that they are not part of the civilized company of nations as long as they are doing what they are doing. And so that's pressure from inside. To make Israeli companies and companies that deal with Israel pay the price of that also, and to work on Western public opinion. So I believe that BDS has started to work. You get, for example, the fact that Israel has now put aside I don't know how many millions for what they call hasbara, for the PR, and people, academics, artists, whatever, from Israel who travel outside are given a course in what to talk about. This is because BDS is working, and they have to counter it. This is its effect, you see. I think that it is the way that is open to us. So even if it was not working, we have to make it work, But also, I really do believe that it is beginning to work. It's beginning to have an effect. It's unmeasurable. Basically, South Africa, you could not have told 3 years before it broke. You couldn't have told it was going to break, but it did. So you can't tell, but you can tell that something is happening, something is changing, that the state of Israel is worried, and our Israeli friends tell us that this is the way to go.
Ahdaf, connected to this, I have a question to ask you. We need to end it up. Just the last question.
Last one.
Last question, right. Connected to this, I have a very important question I want to ask you, which is there is a lot of talk about the next Palestinian Gandhi, something that you've spoken about yourself. But I want to ask you this question. It might seem atrocious, but I want to ask this question honestly. Do you think a Gandhi would work in today's Palestine? Do you think that
I'll
would
tell
give
you.
those results?
All the Palestinian Gandhis that we have are either killed or they are in Israeli jails. The fact is that there is a nonviolent resistance movement, that if you look up nonviolent resistance, if you look up the electronic intifada, if you look up, there are these villages like Budros, which a film has been made about, like Bilayin, where non-violent Palestinian activists are there together with internationals, together with Israeli dissidents, and they are there practicing non-violence, singing in the face of Israeli soldiers. Where is the coverage? And the Israelis kill them. They killed 3 people from one family, and the woman, the sister, was killed 3 weeks ago, and a couple of weeks before that her brother, and so on. There's an international who is sort of in a coma now with a gas canister shot into his head. Basically, Gandhi would have been killed by the Israelis within a week of starting, you know. So there is not going to be a Palestinian Gandhi in the sense of one who unites the whole country behind him, because he's not going to be given time to do that. But there are several who are now working in different villages, in different towns, in different locations, on the principle of nonviolent resistance, creative, etc., and inclusive. Inclusive. That is really important to remember. They're there. And it's the fault of the media that it is not giving these people coverage.
Ahdaf, what will make Fatah and Hamas come together? Is there any way that these two can come together?
I wish, and I think that there is, if Egypt were playing an honest role, that would be what it would do. The Egyptian government could do it.
Could act as mediator.
Could act as mediator and could really genuinely bring Hamas and Fatah together. And they need to come together for the sake of their people. But it's very difficult to see how that can happen.
Right. Thank you so much, Ahdaf.
Thank you so much. Your questions were excellent, and I'm very glad to have done this interview.
I know, me too.
Thank you.
I know.
Thank you.